Hi everyone and welcome to episode number 27 of the Australian Rock Show. My name is Dennis Gray from the Rockin' and Rollin' Gray Brothers. Today is Saturday the 11th of July 2015 when this show is being recorded. If you are a fan of hard rock and heavy metal from down under, there is a book which you must own, the just published Encyclopaedia of Australian Heavy Metal, a publication which was produced by longtime Sydney headbanger Brian Giffin. This book is amazing and I thought we should get Brian on the show to talk more about it. It's an interview recorded last Tuesday, the 7th of July, by the way, which we'll get to in a moment. But before we do, as we often do, let's get in the mood with a song. And this one was chosen by Brian. Here is Sydney's Mortal Sin from 1986 with the track Lebanon. Brian, welcome to the Australian Rock Show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Dennis.
Look, congratulations on the release of your book. What a labour of love. It looks incredible. It's exhaustive, well-researched, and in my opinion, an essential publication for anyone who loves Australian hard rock and heavy metal. What's the reaction been like so far?
Well, thanks for saying so, Dennis. Well, most of the people that have seen it and managed to get a hold of it so far have all pretty much said that, more or less the same sort of thing, really. I haven't had many reviews or anything like that yet because I haven't actually got it out to many places for that sort of thing. I'm just concentrating at the moment on getting it out to the people who've already bought it.
Okay.
And you know, it's a big enterprise, sort of getting a book like this out to the media. So that's probably going to happen. I'll probably be doing that in the next few days.
Okay. What I really love about a book like this, besides using it for research purposes, if I was writing an article or preparing for an interview, it's just fun sometimes to sit down and flick through this, feed my brain, if you like, on bands and info I didn't know about. That is essentially what I enjoy most about a book of this nature. And obviously, as it details many bands whom I saw live, it has a personal feel to it. Do you know what I mean?
I hope so. That's the idea I was trying to get across. Good.
It's a hardcover book and one which is obviously a labour of love. So how did it come together?
Okay, well, this is actually I've released versions of this book before. They're all self-published, and I wanted to do it. I guess I wanted to do it one last time to make sure that I did it properly, because the last one I did was in 2008. And the whole landscape has changed so much since then that I really wanted to capture it. And the whole idea for the hardcover thing, the way it's been done this time around, it came about from a Facebook conversation I was having with Jason from Blood Duster. I mentioned on there that I was thinking of redoing it all. And he sort of said to me, well, if you're going to do it this time, man, why don't you do it properly?
Sure.
So, he suggested that I do a possible campaign for the fundraising, get some money and just do it properly for good, do like a coffee table size or a hardcover and get the proper artwork and all that sort of stuff. And so I just developed that idea from there. So really it was, I had the idea to do it. He just sort of helped me refine it a bit, I suppose.
Well, I think my brother and I, we owned an early copy. It was on Moonlight Publications. That's going back some years.
Yeah, that's right.
And that was so. It's great to have it updated to in this format. So the crowdfunding, it basically covered printing and production costs. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's pretty much what it did. I had to get myself a new printer so that I could do rushes and stuff, and I had to get I had to get some software so that I could do the the actual layout, because you've got to have particular software to do a book. You can't just use Word or whatever, or your general desktop publishing. You need specific stuff for that. So I had to buy that, and the publications itself, because it's hardcover, it costs a little bit extra to do each one, and getting it sent out here because they're actually printed in France. So then they've got to come out here, and the postage alone costs something like $500. So that helped cover most of the costs, yeah. And I did a CD with it too. That the people who got involved with the possible could choose to buy. So I had to pay for the costs for that as well. So it was just basically a way to cover the costs that I was gonna incur from doing it.
Okay, and I guess the fact that your target was more than reached is indicative of the fact that there's a lot of people who are interested in the history of hard rock and heavy metal in this country. But I've got to ask you that in terms of information, finding band info on current outfits is pretty easy, but how did you gather information about, say, bands before 1990?
Well, before 1990 was hard. Fortunately, some of them I knew a fair bit about, like Mortal Sin, for example. They're a Sydney band. I've followed them since they started. So, I had a fair bit of information on them. But there's some bands in there that precede that. Fortunately, I had people like Tubby Wadsworth, who played in a lot of bands in the late 80s.
Sure, Killing Time,
Killing Time, yeah, and Mass Appeal and stuff like that. And he got wind of it and just sent me a whole bunch of stuff about bands like that, that he was either in or he knew personally.
Okay.
And so a lot of it came from people like that. And I've just got a lot of material from back then, a lot of published material, magazines and stuff that was the only way you could find information about it.
Yeah, it sounds like we're the same vintage. So let me drift back a bit. How did your love of heavy metal begin? Did you have friends into metal, or how were you exposed?
Not really. I started listening to metal in about 1982 or 3. I didn't really have any friends that were into it. My brother and I just started listening to it, and we met a few people at like our school and stuff who were into it, but. And they sent me stuff. But like the first thing that I really listened to that I got into was The Number of the Beast. That was the first sort of metal album, I suppose, that I got into, and it just expanded from there gradually over time. I spent most of the 80s listening to Metallica and Iron Maiden, and that was pretty much it for a long time. And then as it just got into a few more bands later on, when a few of them started coming up, and when the Australian scene sort of kicked off, I just wanted to support Australian bands, and I've always had that desire to do that.
Yeah, I hear you. So we kicked off tonight's show with one of your requests, which was Lebanon by Mortal Sin. Yeah. Lifted off their Mahemic Destruction record. So I believe that album, was that one of the first albums you bought, or they were influenced, a large influence to you, weren't they?
Well, certainly it was one of the first albums that I bought that wasn't
international.
That wasn't Metallica. That wasn't Maiden. So when that album came out, I'd heard about it. Of course, I'd started to go to places like Utopia, and I saw them there. And I was a bit young at that time to have actually seen him play, but I thought I'll grab that, and I did, and it was the first Australian metal record that I ever bought. Then I just, as soon as I was old enough, I just started going to see him play. What
was the first band you saw live? Can you remember?
Well, the first band I saw live, I think I went to see the Angels.
Okay.
They did a huge gig at the Paceway in Bankstown, and it was 5 bands for $5. And the Angels were headlining, and they also had the Radiators on the bill as well. So it was a pretty amazing show. So that was probably the first gig I ever saw. Yeah.
Okay, so that's mid-80s, maybe?
84, I think that was. Yeah, something like that, yeah. 1984.
So I guess, like me, after all these years, you've seen tons of bands. Yeah. Can you name your most memorable live gig, one or two, maybe?
Well, I don't know about the most memorable live gigs. I think one of the most memorable gigs I saw was Anthrax's tour with Psycho Myco. That was in 1996.
Yeah. With John Bush was on vocals.
With John Bush, yeah. And they pplayed Salinas in Sydney, and that was certainly one of the best shows I'd seen up to that point. I still remember that show very vividly right to this day, and considering how long ago that was, I've seen some really standouts. I think
it's hard to name just one, I know, but
yeah.
I mean, personally, I've got a lot, but easily my top 5, maybe. I saw Rose Tattoo's first show back January '93 they played this club in Wagga called the Copacabana on a hot summer's night in January, and they just tore the paint off the place.
Yeah, of course
and
they would, yeah.
that was the run of shows leading up to the Guns N' Roses
Yep.
support. But that's definitely one which I always name. It was ungodly loud and very, very memorable.
Yeah, well, I've seen the Tats quite a lot, and they are definitely they're one of the cornerstones of Australian rock of any kind, really. They they took it to the world long before a lot of other bands, and they really didn't get the recognition for it until much, much later. And that's the way that it's been for metal, particularly, always in this country. It's always taken a back seat to whatever's been popular on radio. Another reason why I did the book, there was all these bands doing amazing things, particularly from around about the mid-90s onwards. People just weren't taking them seriously. Like, when Mortal Sin went to Europe and America in 1989, after they toured Australia with Metallica, and they were playing shows over there with Testament and Faith No More, and you couldn't even hear their name mentioned in the local paper. And
I think did they play the Hammersmith Odeon on that tour? I think they did in London, didn't they?
I think they played there. Yeah, they played Hammersmith, and they played. They were doing really big shows with well-known bands. They weren't just going over there and just not doing anything. And they weren't the only band that was doing that. There was lots of bands. If you look through the book there, you'll find other examples of bands that were Berserker from Adelaide. They went over they got picked up and taken over to England and played some shows. They actually broke up over there, and there was all these Australian bands that were doing things overseas that just didn't get talked about here. The same, even if you go back as far as AC/DC, they had to go overseas before anyone would take them seriously here in Australia.
Sure. Kings of the Sun are another one. Had a lot of did a lot of festivals and stuff with Kiss in '88.
Yeah, that's right.
Around Europe, and came back here and were playing the toilets. But
that's right.
Mate, your character sounds very, very similar to myself and my brother. We grew up immersed in rock and metal. We both had huge appetites for information. It just wasn't enough for me to buy a record and see the band. I wanted to know, what other bands the guitarist had been in or what label they were signed to.
Yeah.
And you sound like you're the same. And back then, information on bands, and I'm talking about early to mid-'80s, particularly heavy metal acts in the mid-'80s, was really hard to come by. But there was one book which really taught us so much, and it was called the International Encyclopaedia of Hard Rock and Heavy Metal, which you've probably got.
Yeah, I do. I've got two copies of that.
Oh, okay. Well, we had the one with Mick Box from Uriah Heep on the front.
Yeah.
And owning that book was a godsend. We wore it out. Yeah. And your book is very similar, sits nicely next to it. So congratulations on that, because it's in that vein. Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
Well, that was one of the books that influenced me. In fact, I haven't got the box one. I've got the one that the later issue that came out with
Axl Rose on the cover?
No, it had Murray and Smith from Maiden on the cover. And I got that. And then there was another one they did, because they've not done one since. The next issue that came out, which was about 6 years later, that had Axl Rose on the cover.
Okay, I've got a copy of that.
Yeah, so that was one of the books that influenced the style of the encyclopedia, because it was very, like, a lot of it was very personal. And I thought, well, that's like a way to do it. But earlier versions of the book probably were a little bit more personal than this one, because I wanted to make it a little bit more of a factual thing rather than just my opinion on a lot of the stuff. So
I think you've succeeded, because there's a lot of like a genre like black metal, for example. It's not something I'm terribly familiar with, particularly in this country. Yeah. So it's good for me to flick through that and to learn. And I think that really is valuable for somebody who's into Australian rock and metal. But Brian, let's take a bit of a break and play another one of your choice cuts. And this one is Canberra outfit Alchemist with the song Garden of Eroticism. Why did you choose that one?
I've just always loved that song. Like, Alchemist is one of my favourite ever bands. That was the first song of theirs I actually ever heard, and it impressed me in such a way that I've just never got, I immediately had to know everything I could about them.
Okay.
So yeah, it was just one of the songs that early on into the, that just really grabbed me and I loved. So it's just one of my favourites.
Going back to 1995, that was Alchemist with Garden of Eroticism. Interesting band whose style evolved throughout their career, didn't it?
Yeah, very much. Their very first album was incredibly strange. It was really like nothing else that anyone had sort of done. It was almost like if Frank Zappa decided he was going to play heavy metal one day. That was the sort of vibe. And I think, if you talk to the band, that's the sort of vibe they were trying to get at.
Well, tonight we are chatting with author Brian Giffin about his book, The Encyclopaedia of Australian Heavy Metal. Brian, as I mentioned a short time ago, your book for many of us has a personal feel. For us guys and girls who are immersed in the scene at some time or another, and it's so great that you've documented many of these bands. So do you have a favourite era of Australian metal?
Well, it's interesting, man. I really got involved in the whole scene from probably the mid-90s. Mm-hmm. And I think and so that's the scene that's the era that's really stuck with me the most, I guess, from 95 through to about 2002. I was really involved with, I was always at shows, and I think I've got probably, I'd say, 80 to 90% of the music that came out around about that time that was coming out of Australia. Okay. And, since then I've got, I've been much more involved in outside interests and family and stuff. But I guess if you did say what my favourite period would be, that would probably be it. I think it was really starting to come into its own then.
Sure.
And so I think that's what also...
What, do you mean accepted? More accepted? Has it ever been accepted?
Well, it's becoming increasingly more accepted now. But I think that particular period, especially around about the time when the Metal for the Brain shows were on, and the big day outs, they always managed to squeeze in a couple of Australian metal bands on there. But I think that was the period when the scene was really starting to find itself. There was a lot of bands. The touring circuit, particularly for those metal bands, was really starting to develop. And you were starting to get a lot more people going to shows, and it was really starting to find its support for itself. Obviously not from the mainstream, but they were really starting to build towards the sort of thing that would come along a bit later on.
Well, earlier this year we had a friend of mine, Lino D, on the show. Lino, of course, now with Melody Black, but his history dates back to bands like, of course, the Candy Harlots, Wizard and Rocks. Yeah. And I told him that the era, that era we're talking about with Wizard and Rocks is my favourite era of being into rock and metal, and I'll tell you why. Because it was completely different back then. Nowadays the genre is pretty much accepted and embraced by promoters, but it wasn't always like that. If you were into heavy metal, as you mentioned, in the early 80s in this country, you were an outcast.
Exactly.
But I really felt like we were an army. And somewhere like Utopia, which you mentioned before, Utopia Records, who opened its doors in Sydney, I think around 1978, pretty much single-handedly introduced heavy metal into Australia. They were a godsend. Yeah. Would you agree?
Well, I think so, yeah. That was the only place you could go to get stuff. I mean, you could go, if it wasn't on a major label, you couldn't get it. And even going back to, when Metallica was still doing stuff through Megaforce, there was no other place you could get stuff like that. So you had to go there. I mean, you could buy your Judas Priest and your Iron Maiden at your generic record store, whatever it was back then. It's been so long I can barely remember. But you couldn't get stuff.
Palings, Zounds, they were all in the city.
Yeah.
But a lot of kids didn't want that. They were bored with that kind of stuff, and they wanted. And I actually remember buying we had the Metallica albums on Banzai Records, I think, which maybe they're a Canadian label. But I must also mention Central Station Records and tapes at Flinders Lane in Melbourne. Yeah. They were great. And also Impact Records in Canberra. Both of those stores at that time were stacked with local and international bands, which you could not find in your local record store. Yep. And I think even you mentioned Mortal Sin. Matt Mora, he opened a store up in Parramatta in the late 80s, how's my memory. And I don't want to get stuck down memory lane, but in late 1985, because we're talking about Utopia, Blackie Lawless from Wasp, I don't know if you remember this, he did an in-store at Utopia when they were at Chalice Arcade in Martin Place. Do you recall that?
No, okay. I don't actually.
Well, it was exciting, and that's the era I'm talking about. It was a magic time to have somebody like that in the country. The genre was ignored The genre was ignored, and here was Blackie Lawless doing an in-store. And besides Utopia, you would also know there was a guy named Steve Murray who had a weekly radio show on 2RRR. Right. He deserves a pat on the back because he was airing material which was not getting any airplay at the time. Did you ever hear his radio show?
Once or twice. Yeah, I do remember Steve's show, and it was the only other way you could get in, that you could find out about it, because even the magazines, you could buy the magazines in the stores, but it was months before you could actually get hold of them. And
that's right, and they were expensive as well. The dollar was really weak then.
Well, they still are. I mean, if you want to get terrorized, you're paying $15-16 for it. And that's just absurd.
Actually, I was going to ask you before. So, what are some of your favourite publications on Australian rock?
Well, on Australian rock overall.
Yeah. Well, obviously, Chris Spencer's book would be, essential.
Well, I think so. Yeah, but I mean, I'm looking at. I'm going like across the board. I think Ian McGrath's Australian Encyclopaedia of Australian Rock and Pop that he did in the early 90s, man. Like, he was doing stuff on there that no one else had covered as well. Because he was involved in the metal scene. He was a label manager at Roadrunner back in the early 90s. So he had the scene too. Other books, I think Murray Eaglehart's book, Blood, Sweat and Beers, is amazing.
It is, and I'm honoured to have a couple of my photographs of the tats in there. Actually, his book on AC/DC is also fantastic. Yeah, that's good. I bought both of those three books that I just mentioned. They were all, I referenced them heavily. Okay.
A lot of because they really did. I mean, he really worked with all those bands, and he got to know them very well. So again, he was the only one telling those stories. So, I mean, books on Australian metal, on Australian rock, I don't think there's enough. I think there needs to be more.
Do you know, there's one which I've always liked, and I've had it for years and years, and it was by the photographer Bob King, called Rock Lens.
Right.
That was I know it's not metal, but it was such an invaluable resource for information on bands who had toured here and local acts.
Yeah.
And I ran into him before Lynyrd Skynyrd last year and at Sydney, and he told me that he's working on another volume. So that's look forward to that. That's for sure. Yeah,
and I think Tracy Hutchinson's book, Your Name's on the Door, that was a good one on the underground scene, because obviously there was a lot of stuff in there from bands that weren't, big time acts that were, keeping the underground going, and that's another good one too.
Actually, we're talking about. I got off track there, but Steve Murray, his show turned me on to bands. I remember, and I was only thinking about this preparing for this interview, but bands like TT Quick, Onslaught, even Cinderella, as well as obviously supporting the local scene in a big way. He used to get a lot of local bands in. And I've got to tell you a funny story. I actually won an album on RRR one night, and he gave me a choice. They said you can go into Utopia and choose an album. So obviously I went in there thinking I was going to have pick of the store, and the guy held up one arm, he had Malice, and on the other arm he had Helix. So, and I chose Helix, so ultimately I lucked out. But a different time. Yeah. I guess kids can't relate to that era, but it was a good memory. Yeah,
but they were the ones that came out with the Play It Loud sticker on them, and it was a little bit cheesy.
Yeah,
I think I remember both of those albums actually. And
okay.
Yeah,
the Helix one's awful actually. I think it's called Wild in the Streets or something like that. All the cliches are covered. And what about some of your favourite live venues when you were younger?
Oh well, I lived in Bankstown, man, and we had Bankstown RSL. Now they didn't have metal bands on; they had like big bands, and
Angels,
and they had the Angels, and that's where a lot of the Live Line albums were recorded. But
that's right.
That was one of the major venues in Western Sydney, and I lived close to that. And I didn't have a license at the time, so I'd go there and then I'd walk home, and it used to take about an hour and a half to walk home from there. But wow. I saw the Choir Boys when they were when they first came back, which would have been about 1987, when they came back after Gable heard his voice.
Okay.
I didn't get to see the Angels there because I was a little bit too young, and but I saw some incredible bands there. I saw Johnny Diesel when he first came to Sydney from Perth, played one of his first gigs in that venue. He was opening for the Radiators, and that was one of my favourites. Salinas was always great. And the Hills Inn at Seven Hills, that was a metal place. But there was the St James Tavern. I went there a few times. the Royal Hotel at Sutherland.
Carringbar Inn used to get metal
was great.
bands
That was
as well.
more of a 90s place for me, though. In fact, I was just out that way on the weekend, watching a band at Miranda and having a bit of a reminisce with
nice
with some people about the Carringbar Inn. So there was some great venues. We've been going down to Sydney Cove Tavern, where the Hard-Ons used to play a lot, and the St James Tavern was great, but you can't even see where that used to be now. All those places were closed. There were so many.
It's the same with the Sydney Cove Tavern. I mean, you can't find that anymore, and I guess the real estate value would be enormous now. So
there was the Evening Star in Surrey Hills, which was called the Evil Star.
Yeah.
And then into the 90s, there was the Lewisham Hotel, but my local for many years, particularly from mid 90s onwards, I guess was the Forest Inn.
Bexley,
which was, man, they had metal bands on there Fridays and Saturday nights for years and years and years. So that was where most of the, like in the city, that's where a lot of the metal bands honed their craft after the Lewisham closed anyway.
Well, your book, and we're talking about the Encyclopaedia of Australian Heavy Metal, a lot of the bands I saw back in the early to mid-'80s, bands like Escape, Surrender, Lotus, Shy Thunder, Stark Raven, Boss and Godspeed, that it encompasses that time in your book, and it's so good to go through and read about other bands associated with those. The list goes on, and I believe it's essential to have bands like these documented in print. Did you see Boss, or you were just a bit too young?
No, I saw Boss. When I supported Twisted Sister, who was the first big band I ever saw.
Nice.
And I went out and bought their record, I think, the following week. It had only just come out. And then, of course, they supported Maiden about 9 months later, so I saw them again.
And they had the Dio support.
Yeah, but I didn't see Dio.
Well.
I didn't get.
Oh, really?
For some reason or other, I never got to saw Dio. So they did a lot of the supports here because they were on RCA, which is a major label. So they naturally got all the supports to the shows that came out. Yeah. But there really wasn't that many. There was only a handful of big bands that would come out here then. When you think about it, Judas Priest didn't come into Australia ever until 2001. That was their first
and I mentioned that on our last show. There were a lot of bands who had, whether it was the dollar, I don't know. There obviously wasn't a lot of support on the ground for bands like that, but Priest, although in saying that, Maiden came out twice, 82 and 85.
Yeah, they did.
I don't know how they did financially on those tours. They obviously didn't play around. I don't think they did Perth.
Well, no, they didn't. Their first tour was interesting because it's actually mentioned in Mick Wall's book. I think it was anyway. Their very first tour of Australia, where they did 4 shows in Sydney. I can't remember where they were, but they did. They did a regional tour on the East Coast as well, and they were playing like bowling clubs and stuff. So
yeah.
They so that was like a full scale tour for them. But they were only a small band. And I don't think they only came out because Number of the Beast actually charted in the top 20 or something, and EMI backed their tour. Or I think it might have been the Rock Station there, which might have been, and this is going back heaps, I think it was 2SM. It was a rock station in Sydney who brought them out and backed their tour. So that's pretty much the only reason that they came out there.
Even on the World Slavery Tour, they played places like Shell Harbour Workers, which now that I think back to that era, I think, wow, what would you give to go and see Maiden in a venue like that nowadays?
Yeah, well, that'd be great, but obviously they wouldn't do it then, and they really weren't playing venues like that anywhere else. They only did it in Australia because that's the only places they could play. And I remember reading at the time, they left half their stage set in Europe because they couldn't fit it in any of the venues here. So we really didn't get the full Slavery tour. And then, by the next time they came out, it was the early 90s, and that tour was a total disaster. That's why they didn't come out for 16 years after that.
I saw that. I think Judge Mercy had the support, but we're getting way off track.
Yeah.
Which is fine. You're the perfect person to get stuck in the past with. But what about, how's your memory for this? I can recall reading that Metallica had maybe a show booked at Coogee Bay Hotel, 86, 87, but it was cancelled because of the bus crash, which killed Cliff Burton. Does that ring any bells for you?
No, it does. That doesn't ring any bells for me. I think I would have known about that.
Okay,
but
no one's mentioned that.
No, I've never actually heard anything about that. The first time I even got an inkling of them tour was '89, and Coogee Bay probably would have been a big enough venue for them in '86, but yeah.
I'm sure I read about it in local press. I'll have to.
It's possible. It could have even just been a rumor at the time, but I'd never actually heard anything about that.
Okay. And actually, we were just talking about Boss. Boss had some success, and I interviewed Craig Shangrati from Boss BB Steel recently. Listeners should check that out because we talk about the local metal scene in the early to mid-'80s quite a bit. Godspeed were another band. I don't know if you recall. They had some great songs and could have gone on to bigger things. So Too Lotus, who I used to see a lot. Both of those bands were on a local compilation released in the mid-'80s called Thunder Down Under. You remember that one?
Yeah, I do. I do remember that, actually. I found it in a record store about 5 years ago. I think it was $1.
Right.
And I bought it. Okay. And I used to have a blog called The Sound Cellar, I think it was. And I actually reviewed it. And I canned it.
Really?
Yeah.
The production wasn't great?
Well, the production wasn't great, but I just thought the song choices were bad as well. The two Godspeed songs on there and the Lotus track were awesome, but I just thought that all the other bands on there just sucked, basically. And I don't know whether it's because I'm, now in my 40s and listening back and groaning at,
okay.
What metal was like back then, or whether, because I'm pretty sure that I probably would never have liked those bands even then.
Huh. Well, I bought it new.
Yeah.
I bought it when it came out, and there was actually to coincide with that release, there was a Thunder Down Under concert held at the Hordern Pavilion, and it was very poorly attended from memory. I don't know who booked that venue, but
I did hear about that. Yes, I heard about it, and I think some big name radio jock, Mike Hammond or someone, was supposed to be the host for it. It was a little bit before my time, I suppose you'd say, but I did hear about it later on because somebody actually told me about it, and I thought...
I was just happy. I was immersed in heavy metal, so I went to everything, and, I loved all those bands, and it was great to read about it in your book. And what's funny is I had a show on community radio back then, and I was playing those bands, and I'm still talking about them now. So it's
yeah. I did enjoy a lot of the bands from back then. I did like Boss, and I've got a single that Shy Thunder put out as well somewhere, and a lot of those early bands there. But it was hard for me to get that stuff, and I didn't actually have a lot of money back then, so
Sure.
I just saved up for the ones that I was really into. And because I didn't turn 18 until 1987, so
okay.
It was really hard for me to get to shows. So I didn't see a lot of them bands.
Well, your book, and we're talking about the Encyclopaedia of Australian Heavy Metal, it covers much territory, and besides listing the lesser-known outfits, a book like this has to include bands who achieved some success. For example, obviously AC/DC, Baby Animals, Screaming Jets, Airborne. Was it difficult to write something new about a band like AC/DC who'd had so much written about them, or you were just happy to just put a little bit about their discography and brief history?
Well, see, the thing about it is that the AC/DC... I think until Murray's book that we spoke about earlier came out, there was still a lot of really shadowy aspects of their early career, particularly, that never been really reported very well. It was very difficult to find good information on the very early lineups of the band, because obviously there was a lot, before the TNT lineup that we all became familiar with. There was like a dozen people that moved through that band, and it was very difficult to find out a lot of information about that. And, because it was buried in history, and that band doesn't really talk much about that period of time. They'll talk about the time from when Bon joined, or, but previous to that, it was just like that was the dark ages, and very difficult to find out stuff like that it's just so long ago. And a band like Buffalo, for example, who were amazing, but almost forgotten, and it's just almost impossible to find anything about a band like that now. From back that time, like who was even in the band, obviously Dave Tice and Pete Wells, but who else was in the band and how many records did they do? I mean, they were on a British label. They were the first Australian band to be signed to Vertigo Records.
Sure.
So that's got to count for something, but do you ever hear about them?
Well, I think that's why Murray's book...
In the 70s, I'll talk about it. Yeah, man, like they'll talk about Skyhooks and stuff, but you never hear about Buffalo. They played at the opening of the Opera House, man. That's a big thing.
Sure. I think Melanie Safka was there as well, but getting way off track. Actually, that's why Blood, Sweat and Beers, Murray Engelhardt's book, is an essential purchase for people who are interested in Australian rock and roll history. But Brian, let's play another tune, and then we'll tell listeners how they can get a hold of your book. And you've chosen Nice Boys by the Mighty Rose Tattoo. Great choice.
Yeah.
Why did you select this one?
It's just a great song, man. That's all there is
Great
to
song. Can't argue with that. Let's hear the Tats from 1978 with Nice Boys. For Brian Giffin, that was, of course, Australia's very own Rose Tattoo with the song Nice Boys, which was also covered by Guns N' Roses around 1986 on their Live Like a Suicide EP. You've obviously heard GNR's version of that tune. Brian, what are your thoughts?
All I heard them, I'm pretty sure they played it live when they came to Australia the first time.
They did.
Yeah, so I've heard them do it. They do it respectfully, I think.
Do you know what it misses, though?
Yeah.
It misses Wells' monstrous slow
well,
guitar.
of course it does. It misses that. And that was the thing that made Rose Tattoo stand apart from a lot of other bands, man, was that playing, that slide playing.
Sure.
And it's just such a thing. It's just such a shame that, like, all the guys that played on that record, except Angry, of course, have passed away, and they still don't get the appreciation that they deserve for the what they had managed to achieve. And it's just, I just think it's really sad, that such a great band, if they'd come from probably any other country in the world, they would have been, much more respected, probably much more successful than they were.
Yeah, but I think, fans who know music, and I mean, live it and breathe it, they get Rose Tattoo like they get Motorhead,
Yeah.
It's the same kind of thing. But yeah, I said to somebody, I think I had Jeff Hode from Kings of the Sun on this year, and I'd stack that debut Rose Tattoo album up against anything ever released. It's just a monster.
Yeah, it is. It's absolutely. It is. It's an incredible record, and yeah, you're right. You could put it aside anything that's come out before or since, and it's still going to stand up to it.
No argument here. Look, Brian, was there a point in your years as a fan when you realised that Australian bands were just as good, if not better, than international acts, or had you always held that opinion?
Straight away, man.
Straight away.
It wasn't just the metal, because obviously I was listening to music before that. And Australia always had fantastic bands right from the start, man. Like, I'm a huge Cold Chisel fan. They're one of my favourite bands, and they're easily one of the best bands from anywhere.
Sure.
And just, I mean, the whole time from the 80s onwards, when Australian music was starting to make a bit of an impression overseas, those bands were just doing things that the other bands any bands from anywhere could have done, just taking it to the world. It was really not, it's not a competition, but I think that the bands from anywhere can sound as good as a band that, from America, from Britain. It doesn't matter where you're from. It matters where, it just matters the songs you write and the talent you've got can come from anywhere. There's not just, who'd have thought that, I guess, in the late 1980s, who would have thought that there would have been so many Swedish bands that were making such an impression on heavy metal from like 1990 onwards?
I think, though, that the characteristics which made, particularly from where we were physically located in the world in the 70s and 80s, blend that with a tough live environment. All that worked towards making bands develop this kind of a psyche. Do you know what I mean? That's why.
Yeah.
Bands, by the time they went overseas, even bands like In Excess, they were already battle hardened. I've said that. I said that to Chris Bonacci a couple of weeks ago. To give you a side note to Cold Chisel, though, outside of Australia, I've met lots of musicians. Musicians always get it.
Yeah.
Rock musicians, and they'll say to me, "Have you ever heard of this band called Cold Chisel?" Or the musicians get it.
They do, and I think you find strange markets. The Germans love Cold Chisel. They really did. And when I did a version of the book that was picked up years ago called the Australian Metal Guide, and it was published in Germany. And the publishers actually said that they wanted Cold Chisel in the book because they were actually really big over there, man. They were a huge concern, and they weren't metal in a million years, but they wanted me to put them in the book. So I did, and I did that because the Germans loved them, and there was and we find these strange places that appreciate Australian bands. I guess it's the same sort of thing when there's some band here in Australia that we just take and really like, and we become their biggest market outside of their home country. It just,
Same thing,
it
yeah.
happened other ways. Like Faith No More were more popular in Australia than they were in America for many, many years.
Mm. Mate, I imagine you've seen a lot of live gigs. In your opinion, this is a tough one for you. Which local band or bands should have made it big but didn't?
Oh, that's a really tough question. You mean at an international level?
Yeah, like a band you used to see live locally, and they had so much potential.
Geez, I don't know. Because
I always name Heaven as the band who could have taken the world, but didn't.
Yeah, well, Heaven definitely had the potential. I think the main problem with Heaven was they couldn't keep a lineup together. But there was, that is a hard question. I'm not sure I can answer it because there was just so many that could have. It's a tyranny of distance, really. To get to America, even now, it's really hard to get over there and have to start from the bottom again. I suppose if you want to think, if there's one band that I can think, and I'm only thinking of this because I can't think of anybody else, would be the Mark of Cain.
Okay.
If they had managed to get overseas at any point at the right time, I think they would have been just as revered as, because they, stylistically similar to bands like Helmet and Joy Division and stuff like that. They could have been, as well known as those bands in other markets, but they were never able to get overseas, and so that's one band that probably could have and deserved to be much better known outside of Australia than what they were and are.
I think I would have seen them live a couple of times. Did they have a support for Babes in Toyland in mid-90s?
They possibly did.
Okay.
I didn't see them with Babes, but they toured with Rollins a lot. Yeah, in the late 90s through to the early zeros, they were, they did sold out tours around Australia every time they went out on the road.
Mm.
And they were just a really good live band, always great, and easily could have been appreciated by overseas audiences because they were just so intense and just such a great live band. And it was a real shame they were never able to get any sort of establishment overseas at all. They've never played outside of Australia.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Mate, well, we are running out of time, and before we finish, I must say that as someone who was raised on hard rock and heavy metal, this hardcover book will be one of my all-time favourite resources. Thank you again for putting in the work in compiling it. It's really appreciated. What is the best way for people to purchase the Encyclopaedia of Australian Heavy Metal?
Well, because it's self-published, it's not in shops at the moment. I'm not sure if it ever will be, but it's online. Most online book retailers will have it. It's published on lulu.com, so that's the best place to get it from because I actually get paid more if you buy it from there. But it's on Amazon. It's on Ingram. I know for example that it's on the Agassiz Robertson online bookstore, but they want a lot of money for it.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
So Lulu is the best place?
Lulu's the best place, yeah, lulu.com. You can just do a search for it on there and it'll come up. And you can also get a paperback version as well.
Oh, good.
Which is
it available? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, the paperback version is cheaper and you get it quicker because that's printed in Melbourne. But the hardcover's sturdier, but you've got to wait about 6 weeks for it to arrive. Sorry,
it's worth the wait.
Yeah.
Is it available as an ebook as well?
No,
mate?
no, it's not. I'm not sure if it will because I'll have to reformat everything and I don't want to spend 4 months doing that. But it might be in the future.
Okay. Are there any plans for another book?
Possibly. This was because I got a love-hate relationship with this because I've been doing this for so long.
Sure.
That I wasn't sure I'd ever do another one. But I might. I can't say no because it might happen again, but it probably won't be for a while. And if I do it again, I'll probably do it with a couple of people helping me.
Okay, fair enough. Did you have some involvement with the Metal Down Under DVD documentary?
Yeah, I did. I actually approached Nick about that when I first heard about it.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, he came to my house here in the Blue Mountains and did an interview with me in my living room. That was pretty much my total involvement with it. He just interviewed me come up and we had a chat for a couple of hours about different things. And He bought an earlier version of the book off me for research purposes, but I wasn't really that involved in the film, in the production or anything. I was just interviewed for it.
It's an interesting documentary, and I think if fans want to get a hold of that, they could probably go to JB Hi-Fi. I think I've seen it in there. Mate, congratulations again on the book, and let me state once again that if anyone is a disciple of hard rock and heavy metal, you need this book. Thank you again for your time, mate.
Not a problem at all, Dennis. Thanks for taking the time to have a chat with me.
You're very welcome. Thanks, mate.
Thank you.
Well, I hope everyone enjoyed my interview there with author Brian Giffin. Lulu.com, that is the website you need to visit if you wish to purchase Brian's book. In the search field, simply type Encyclopaedia of Australian Heavy Metal. I cannot recommend this book highly enough, and again, kudos to Brian for undertaking and completing such a massive project. Okay, let's get out of here. AustralianRockShow@gmail.com, that's the easiest way to reach us. If you haven't done so already, give us a thumbs up on Facebook. It's also helpful if you share the show to your timeline on Facebook. Our website is at AustralianRockShow.com, where you can find all the past episodes. We are also on iTunes, Stitcher and TuneIn Radio. Please, and I know I say this nearly every episode, but if you are listening in via iTunes, support us by taking 2 minutes out of your day and leaving us a show review. It improves our ranking and helps to spread the word. Again, our website address is at AustralianRockShow.com. We're going to close out with a recent song request, and this one is for Graham Thomas up there in Toowoomba. Mate, thank you very much for the $5 donation. We really, really appreciate it. Graham also says, I recently discovered your podcast and have been listening to the past episodes whilst driving to work each day. My first concert was AC/DC at Festival Hall in Brisbane back in 1981. Aussie rock music is what I was raised on, and you are doing a great job with your podcast. The interviews are interesting, and I have learnt a lot from your show. Mate, I think I'm going to print out your message and pin it up, because your feedback means a lot, it really does. We try to keep the interviews interesting. We have a long list of artists who we aim to get on the show, so keep listening, and thanks again. You too can send us a donation and indeed get your song request aired and shared with the world. Pay to play, folks. Simply head to AustralianRockShow.com, click on the donate button, and of course, be sure to include your song of choice. Something which Graham actually forgot to do. His message just states, your choice, Dennis. Well, for you, mate, and in keeping with the theme of tonight's show, I'm going to play something from 1974 which still kicks ass. You all know the drill by now. If you are listening in whilst driving, turn the volume up and roll the window down so you can educate others. Lifted off their Only Want You For Your Body album, here are Buffalo with I'm a Skirt Lifter, Not a Shirt Raiser. This is Dennis, out.